Just wait for people to come into the Zoom here. Oh, we've got quite a lot of people to start. Hello, everybody. Hi there. I recognize some faces. Thank you for joining us. We have our Open Academy alumni meetup today on the topic of ethics and informed consent. So just before we get started, if I can ask you to please mute your mic if you're not asking a question. Any questions that you do have, please type in the chat there. You can raise your hand if you wish to speak, and we'll pick on you at the right moment. The session will last an hour and 30 minutes, and it will be recorded. You can also add the closed captioning, which you should be able to see in the bar on Zoom there with a little CC sign. So feel free to add that. And at the end, we just ask you to tell us how we did in the survey, which will pop up automatically. And I'll send that round afterwards with the recording. So now that's all out the way, I would like to introduce you to the agenda. We have just a quick introduction and announcements, which I'll go through. Then we'll have a presentation lasting an hour and a discussion after that. We're joined by our speaker today, Mandy Daly, who's Director of Education and Research at the Irish Neonatal Health Alliance. So she's an expert on this subject. And just for your diaries, we have the next meetup coming up in April. And I'll share the link to that in the chat and also after the session. So I think that's everything from me. I'll pass over to Mandy now.
Thank you.
Let you share your screen, Mandy.
So,
Perfect.
good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Rachel. My name is Mandy Daly, and I'm the Director of Education and Research with the Irish Neonatal Health Alliance. And for those of you who don't know what neonatal health is, it's we work with premature babies. For starters, I'm going to ask you guys to participate in the Slido poll so I get a sense of who I'm speaking to today. Are you patients, family members, carers, patient representatives from nonprofits or patient organizations? Are you from the research community? Are you in education? Are you an industry partner or with other? I'm just curious to see who I'm speaking to today. Oh, excellent. Good stuff. That was pretty quick. So we have mostly patient representatives, we have the patient, we have family and member carers. That's great. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of history about me while this Slido is continuing. So way back in 2006, I was working in the healthcare as a radiographer. I gave birth to a child who was very early, 25 weeks gestation, which is 15 weeks early, and found myself on the other side of the caring fence. And as a result of that experience, ended up founding the Irish Neonatal Health Alliance. We're a collaborative platform. We are multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary, working with all the different stakeholders within the area of neonatology and pediatrics. And basically, it's just a platform to help all the stakeholders collaborate together, because my experience was simply that good work was happening that was happening in silos, and it just simply wasn't happening cohesively. So I took it on board for selfish reasons, I must admit, because once we were discharged from hospital after a very long time, I found the support for families in my situation was very limited. Okay, so what are we looking at in the poll? So we're predominantly patient representatives. We do have family members coming in next, and carers, patients, and then we have some researchers at 9%. Okay, guys, let's just, we have educators as well. That's excellent. So we don't have any industry partners here today. Okay, let's move on, and we shall move on with the talk. So as I said, I founded the Neonatal Health Alliance. My particular areas of interest happen to be research and education. And in the last 18 years, I've been a patient researcher on over 70 clinical studies. And we also I've done quite a bit of work in the development of poor outcome sets. I've been working with our National Office of Research Ethics since 2020, and that was set up to standardise the research ethics approval process here in Ireland. And we're a multi-model set up in that we still have the old research ethics groups within our hospital institutions still exist, but then we have this national group which looks at the broader clinical trials that are coming into the country and anything with investigational medicinal products we come across our desk. 25% of our membership is from the lay community, and by lay I mean people with no health background, no research background, maybe simply just an interest, or a family carer, or somebody who may work in education or in statistics. So it's a very rounded committee. We meet once a month and we get through hundreds and hundreds of research applications. We have 4 ethics committees. We have 2 clinical trials. We have 1 for medical devices and 1 for COVID-19 biobanking. What else do? I also work for funding agencies as a reviewer. So when applications for funding are received by our agencies, it comes across my desk to see that I get the opportunity to say yes or no if a funding application is not appropriate or is too burdensome or is not meaningful to the patient community. It doesn't get funded. So we're getting to see people like me embedded right through the entire clinical study process here in Ireland, which is great. I also do a bit of supervising for PhD students. I do a lot of co-authoring on medical papers, and I do some teaching to medical students. So today we're going to talk about informed consent in clinical research. At outset, it might seem like a small topic. Once you deep dive into it, you will find that it's much more comprehensive than you may have thought, and it's one of the founding principles of research ethics. So when we sit on a research ethics board, if the informed consent process is not up to standard, the entire application does not get approved. So it actually forms a very important part of a research ethics application. And what is informed consent? It's where a participant or a potential participant for a clinical trial gives their permission to participate in that research. They only give that permission after an in-depth conversation has taken place. What the researchers are obliged to do when they're talking to potential participants is that they have to value the participants' rights, their beliefs and opinions. And what's really important about informed consent, it's a rolling and dynamic process, and it continues throughout the entire duration and life cycle of a study. So instead of being a single time point where we get somebody to sign a form and then they're deemed to have given their consent, that is just one part of the consent process, that's signing of the consent form. The consent process exists throughout. So at every juncture of a study, we always have to keep reminding ourselves of reconsenting, that the consent is still there, that the applicant has a participant has an opportunity to say no, that they want to withdraw. And it's very important that also participants in studies are aware of that. So when somebody who does sign up to participate in a study does sign that form, that we tell them that the informed consent process actually is a dynamic process and it exists throughout the life cycle of that study. So that I think a lot of patients are not aware of that, and they feel once they've signed their life away on a consent form that that's it, they have no opportunity to withdraw. We have to make sure that when giving informed consents, that we protect the dignity and rights of all the people who are participating in our trials. And we also have to make sure that the data that we're collecting is actually safeguarded. And I think we're all familiar now with GDPR at this point, but we'll talk a little bit later about it. So the ethical principles underpinning consent is that we respect for participants and also for the researchers. So when we say respect, that the participants who are being invited to participate in that research are doing so voluntarily, they're making their own minds up based on the information that is given to them, and that they're not under any due pressure or coercion to participate. We also have to be sure that when getting signed consent, informed consent from participants, that they do have the capacity to make that decision. And there are different pieces of legislation in different countries which safeguard individuals who may not have the capacity to make decisions on their own behalf. We also have to ensure that the participants don't become subject to any harm during a study, that we maximize their safety. And we have to be fair in who we invite to join our studies. I think we'll all agree that the vast majority of those people that participate in studies will be middle class, white, Caucasian, versus some of the minority groups, because we don't necessarily reach those and invite them to participate. So I think that justice isn't always adhered to, but where possible, we should consider all of society when designing a study, and to ensure that everybody is invited to participate who actually fulfills the admission criteria. And when people participate in studies, we have to think, why are they doing it? So our participants can sometimes find themselves in a vulnerable position, in that they may have a condition for which there's no therapy, for which a therapy exists that isn't very successful, and they may be very unwell, and they may see the research as an opportunity to, in their minds, improve their quality of life. But that may not be the case. And we have to be very clear when interacting with potential trial participants that we explain the risks associated with participating, maybe the potential benefits, but also the potential pitfalls. I mean, some of our participants will avail of a placebo, and that can sometimes be problematic when patients realize that they're not in receipt of this new investigational product and they're just receiving sugar and it's not going to make any difference. So I think a lot of people, when they participate, we have to be aware that they're doing it for the right reason. So they're doing it really, the reason they should be participating is to make it better for people in the future. So the trial participant rights, what we have to remember is that they always have to be opted in, but on a voluntary basis. There can't be any coercion, that they're treated throughout the duration of the study in a fair manner, and that they're not exploited or subject to any harm or exposed to any undue risks. And above all, that their privacy and confidentiality is respected. And the last is usually taken care of by GDPR and data protection laws, which again differ in different states. So what does the actual consent process look like? So what is the consent process that you and I might have thought about today? We often think it's the form, the participant reads the form, they ask a few questions, they sign it. So every trial participant has to have enough information available to him or her to allow them to make a decision about whether they want to participate in that trial or not. They must be given sufficient time to digest that information and assess it before they make a decision. And that word sufficient time could be, it can be fluid, because some trials are time dependent, some are emergency. So in my area, neonatology, a lot of the trials will take place at the moment of birth. And that is a very difficult time to speak with a family whose baby has just arrived 15 weeks early and who is in a really poor medical condition. So how do you give them sufficient time when they don't have it? So it's a fluid one. And I think researchers just need to be kind of situationally aware when they're approaching potential applicants. Consent can only be given when it's freely and voluntary. So again, no coercion, no enticements. We sometimes see on research applications amounts of money being paid to trial participants. And we as a research ethics committee need to be convinced that the amount that's been given to trial participants is not viewed as an enticement to participate, and that it literally is sufficient to cover any expenses incurred by participants. And I think trial participants often don't know that they can withdraw their consent at any time throughout the process, and that must be very explicit during the conversation that's had at outset. Trial participants need to be told also that any data that will be gathered from them will be the minimum amount of data that is needed for this research to be carried out, that there's not going to be additional data gathered about them and used for other reasons. And if they say no, it's okay to say no, and it won't impact their quality of their standard of care. And I think, again, there's that vulnerability between an ill patient with no therapeutic options and the opportunity to participate in a trial. There is no standard of care for that. They feel they should participate in it. We just have to make sure that they understand that they may not benefit from it and that it is investigational. And I think those conversations have to be had in a very clear and concise manner before anything is signed. Consent obviously happens before the participant enters the research, and it takes place in 2 stages, preferably where time allows. So it's where we give the participant the information, they get a chance to read it, they're given sufficient time, they can go and talk to family and friends or maybe their doctor. And if they have some questions, then they come back to us as researchers, and another meeting is held. And we go through again the entire process with them, outline what's going to happen in the research study, and inquire if they have any questions, if they have anything that they need clarification on. And only at that point, when we are satisfied that they have capacity to make a decision, that they fully understand all the salient points, only then is consent deemed to have been obtained. So this is a very busy slide, and I know some of the links to some of these directives will appear in the chat, but consent process is always supported by legislative framework. And within the EU, we have the EU Clinical Trial Regulation, and we also have the General Data Protection Regulation. So the Data Protection Regulation just safeguards the personal data that is being gathered from trial participants, and it ensures that it's not used for any uses outside of that research unless specifically stated and unless specifically consented by the trial participant. Here in Ireland, we no longer have individuals who are considered not able of making decisions. And we have a new act called the Assisted Decision Making Act, which, even though it came out in 2015, was only ratified, I think, last year. So it assumes that every individual has a capacity to make a decision, but that they may require different levels of support to help them make that decision. It's quite a detailed piece of legislation, but what it does is it allows us to reach those elements of our community that heretofore would have been excluded from participating in a lot of our trials. Obviously, we have a Data Protection Act, and even nationally, we even have national policies around consent in health and social care. And internationally, there are even international ethical guidelines also around ethics and informed consent. So what it suggests to do later is maybe have a look at some of these and see if there is something similar in your own country. Obviously, the CT trial regulation and the general data protection are applicable to all the EU member states. But nationally, you may find that there are pieces of legislation or actually national policies from your national departments of health which focus specifically on obtaining consent and how it should be done. When we talk about the capacity to consent, what we're trying to work out is the ability of the potential trial applicant, how they will use and understand the information we give them about the trial, and how that will be used for them to make a decision about participating or not. It's important to remember that your capacity can change over time. So in terms, if you've got a medical condition and maybe a mental health condition, that may directly impact your ability to make a decision. In Ireland, that would fall under the auspices of the Assisted Decision Making Act. So there may be different levels of support that you would require over time to make a decision. And in order to consent to participate, in some countries, if you are not able to make a decision, you cannot then be deemed capable of giving consent to participate. We do know what impaired capacity, it's outlined in Irish legislation. Again, it may differ in your own countries. So basically, impaired capacity means the person isn't able to understand the information we're giving them. Maybe they can't remember the information so that they can't actually use that information to make a decision. And maybe they have difficulty with speaking or sign language. And again, that is no longer applicable here. It may still be applicable in your own countries. And it's probably worth delving into some of the legislation around consent to see what safeguards there are in place for people whose capacity may not be 100%. And again, whose capacity can change over time. So if somebody's capacity changes over time, where does that stand in terms of consent? So you have to be constantly aware if they have the capacity to consent at outset and that capacity now is no longer available midway through a study, how is that managed? So the different types of consent, we all know, and we would probably all volunteer the written oral consent, which is where the conversation happens between the researcher and the potential participant, and then they sign a form at the end. We also have other forms of consent. We have oral informed consent. We're now seeing a lot more of e-consent. There's tiered consent, emergency consent, which often applies in the area that I work. We have consent for incapacitated adults. We have minors who can give consent, and we have consent for neonates, which is our babies. So let's look at the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is the written oral informed consent. So this can happen in situations where the applicant is able to understand a complex issue. So None of us has really seen a very short patient information leaflet. They usually come in around 20 to 50 pages, and we're expecting a layperson in our community to assimilate all this information about the trial they're thinking of participating in. So we need to be sure that the information we provide in written format, they have the capacity to understand it. And how do we know that? We have to know, can they read? Can they write? And we definitely need to be able to give a voluntary consent. We have to give them lots and lots of time. We need to give them time to address any issues they may have. And we have to make sure that they realize that any data they give us is going to be safeguarded. A lot of patients will tell us that their biggest fear is that their standard of care treatment will be affected, or how is it going to affect them, when they finish the trial, what happens to their care pathways then? So there are lots of ancillary considerations during the consent process that form part of the conversation that the researchers need to be equipped to handle. We don't see this too often. It's oral informed consent. It's where the researcher and the participant have a conversation, and it's very similar to the written consent, but nothing is put down in writing. The applicant does not sign anything. And this may sometimes happen where literacy is a problem, or where there are culture about political concerns, where maybe a signed contract might push either the researcher or the participant at risk, or where time is very limited. So literally, if the trial applicant becomes, what's the word I'm looking for, suitable to be put into a trial, and they are not in the same location as the researcher, they can do a remote conversation online, but at some point there has to be a record kept of that conversation. So whilst there's no signature, somebody has to keep a written record that the conversation took place, what was said, who agreed to what. E-consent, we're seeing a lot more of these days. Obviously, we're going into the digital age, and it's just another way of getting consent from people, but it's done in the format of maybe emails, electronic forms, maybe where you upload a scan, signed document. You can actually use an electronic signature. All of these now are forms of consent. You have to ensure that with the e-consent, exactly the same rules apply, that the applicant is allowed as much time to the type of research that's happening, what's going to happen during it. If they've any questions, there has to be a forum for them to be able to contact the research group and have their questions addressed. And again, one of the nice things I think about the e-consent platform is because consent is dynamic, and because your participant has had to log on to an online platform to give consent, if they decide at any point they want to withdraw it, they just do so via that online platform again. And sometimes that's easier for patients to withdraw as opposed to having that face-to-face conversation with the research team when a participant feels they no longer want to continue in that study. And they can be in that vulnerable situation. So the e-consent platform, I suppose, allows them to say, I'm done now, thanks very much, and they withdraw, and they don't necessarily have to have a conversation with anybody. Tiered consent is something that is becoming problematic for research ethics committees. So, as I said, I work for the Research Ethics Committee here in Ireland. We are more or less insisting that tiered consent is now on all of our applications, because the number of studies that have come across our desk that are researching a particular question, but then they're also gathering additional biological information, or they're gathering additional samples, whether they're blood samples or skin biopsies, on the patients for future use in a future research space. And what we were seeing 3 years ago when we started off as a research ethics group was just one consent form, preceded by a very lengthy patient information leaflet, which went through absolutely everything about their research, and then absolutely everything about what was going to be gathered in terms of biological samples. And it was very text heavy. And then there'd be one page of all these little sentences where someone said, yes, I agree, I read it, I understand everything, I agree to this, 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 and this. And it was a tick box. And as a research ethics group, we felt that patients were probably being overburdened with a lot of technical information and may not have been aware as to what they're consenting to. So what we now do is we insist on a tiered consent form. So we will have a consent form for the study. But then if the researchers want to do something additional, maybe they want to gather biological samples for future reference, or they want to use some of the discarded blood samples for something else, each of those actions is viewed as an independent consent, and they form a different consent page so that the patient knows that the first page is about the particular research study. And then there are some options that the patient also has to read through and has to physically sign their name and date. And I think it's just more to focus the participants on the fact that they are agreeing to give their material, their data to strangers to be stored for possible use in the future. And again, we have to be really clear when we're designing consent forms that we know what we're going to do with this data or these samples, where they're going to be stored, what are they going to be used for? Are they going to be used for research about the original research? So if the original research is about leukemia, can we just say the future samples will only be used for leukemia? Yes, we can. And as a research ethics committee, that's what we like to see, where it's kind of kept within the same medical area. But what we are seeing sometimes are these very vague worded consents saying, we want to use your biological samples for future research. And then there's nothing. And for us as a committee, that really doesn't bode well, because it means you're handing over your personal data, your personal samples to A, you don't know who, you don't know what's happening to them, and you've no control of what's going to happen to them in the future. So it is really important that we relay to participants every single aspect of what's going to happen to every sample we take from them. So in tiered consent, it is quite, what's the word? It's quite deep when you go into all the different options. But I think what we do need to be very clear about is, if we are taking biological samples from patients and we want to use them in the future, are we going to ask them in the future for their consent? Or are we going to do it now and say, you are giving your consent for something in the future? It's a difficult one for a patient, because usually when the research is about their medical condition and then there's additional stuff, they don't necessarily think about the additional stuff, because they're very focused on the research is about trying to find a therapeutic for my medical condition so they can have whatever they want and I'll be doing something good for society. Unfortunately, we don't still have the rigorous controls in place. And I think when we are reading consent forms, we need to be reminding ourselves, what am I agreeing to here? Am I agreeing to somebody using my data for whatever they want? How do I feel about that? What are the implications to that? So we have to make distinctions about the future research. Is it in my disease area? Is it not? And will I be giving my consent now? Or do they have to come back to me whenever they want to use it? So again, as a patient, that's what you should be doing when you're reading a consent form. If it's ambiguous, you go back to the researchers and get clarification on it. So emergency consent tends to happen where an individual has a life-threatening condition, they need an intervention immediately, all the available treatments that are there are not proven, and a clinical trial is available, but because of their condition, they're not in any fit state to give their consent. So their clinician will be the one who makes a call, if they can't get access to any legal representatives for that family, to say, the risks here are, as this patient is going to die, we have no other option, and we think there's a possibility that this treatment may be effective. What they are obliged to do, if they cannot find a legal representative at that time, is they have to keep looking. And when they do find a legal representative, after they've decided to opt for the emergency consent, they then have to consent the legal representative of that patient. So it's very important that that loop is actually closed, and that they're not just left out there, that the doctor or whoever has made that decision to put the patient into a clinical trial is not supported by, I suppose, consent from another legal representative of that patient. So what do we do when we're consenting babies? Babies obviously don't talk for themselves. In my area, we try, where possible, to have conversations with families before the baby is born. And we will often, if a child is going to be born in a teaching hospital where a lot of research happens, we will talk about it during the antenatal period and say, you know, this is a hospital that does a lot of research. There is a chance that maybe when your baby is born, there might be a clinical trial that might be appropriate for your baby to be part of. And, you know, the baby may not have a medical condition, but by virtue of the fact that these babies are preterm, we can get a lot of data from them. So we try and introduce the conversation as early as possible. We try and do it where both parents are there. So it's not just one parent agreeing and later then another parent saying no. And we do have to be very careful when we're asking parents of neonates to participate in clinical trials. It's called situational awareness. These families didn't think they were having their baby that early. 15 weeks is very early for the baby to come. And then if you hit them with, we have a clinical trial and we think your baby should be part of it, they are dealing with a lot at that time. And then you're asking them to participate in a trial. And there's a school of thought which would say to you, maybe they're not in any frame of mind to make a decision. So when my daughter was born, I was approached the day she was born to participate in a clinical trial. I have no memory of what it was about. It had something to do with her heart. I don't remember signing any forms. I'm sure I did. I don't remember receiving any updates on how the trial went. And it was only in hindsight when I was trying to remember afterwards, oh yeah, she did participate in a trial. But like that was a reflection of where my state of mind was at that time. My baby had arrived very early. She was on life support. I probably wasn't fully capable of making a decision. And that was, admittedly, it was 18 years ago, and certainly the landscape has changed, but we do have to remain cognizant that when we are approaching families or patients to participate in a trial, we need to be aware of what their life is like at present, and is their reason for participating in this trial maybe driven by the fact that they're not in any fit state to make a decision, they're desperate. So I think it's always good to take that step back and go, okay, they probably need a bit more time here, or maybe I'll try another family who maybe may not be in such a traumatic state. We talked about this earlier, consent for incapacitated and vulnerable adults. So as a research ethics committee, we don't particularly like to see research done on vulnerable cohorts unless it is absolutely necessary. It's difficult research to conduct. So applicants have to convince us as a research ethics committee that this research can only be done for this cohort because there is no other treatment for them. They have to demonstrate to us that there's going to be a direct benefit to these participants, because it's a much more difficult scenario to manage as a trial if you are dealing with adults who may not be fully capable of decision making, and how do you manage their responses to certain things. So they are difficult and complex trials to design. And the study design team have to be very sure that there are no other alternatives. So for them to get ethical approval, they have to be very clear in their application to a committee. They have to set out very clearly that these participants have nothing else available to them, and that this is the only way of them accessing a therapeutic. Have to make sure as well that because of their vulnerability, that all the risks are categorized, that we are absolutely certain that they're not going to be exploited in any way. And as I mentioned already, in Ireland, we have the Assisted Decision Making Act, which actually is quite a strong safeguard for vulnerable adults. And it also is quite inclusive, because it means now that vulnerable adults, incapacitated adults have that network in place that allows them to be participants in research, which they should be, and it helps them give back to society. But as a research ethics committee, we have to be absolutely convinced that every avenue has been explored during a research study design such that there is no other options available. Just because somebody is classified as a vulnerable adult or an incapacitated adult, it doesn't mean we have to ignore their wishes. It is very implicit that if they have consented to participate and at some point want to withdraw their consent, regardless of their mental ability, the research team must respect that decision to withdraw, and it is imperative that is maintained. And I guess it also, it's good as researchers to remind ourselves that just because somebody is an incapacitated adult at outset of the study, they may regain capacity later on. And maybe participants who regain capacity after an emergency consent was done on their behalf, they then need to be reconsented to continue to participate in a trial. And that involves going back to either the written consent or the oral consent or the e-consent process, and having that whole conversation all over again. And they may say, no, I don't want to participate anymore. And we have to respect that. But it's good to remind ourselves that consent is an ongoing thing. It happens constantly. And just because somebody's capacity alters, it doesn't mean consent is just one particular moment in time. We need to constantly remind ourselves that if the situation has changed, well, then we have to revisit the informed consent process, because now it is a very different landscape. So how do you consent for minors? Again, countries differ for clinical trials here. Once you're over the age of 16, you can consent on your own behalf to participate in a trial. As a research ethics committee, we will only approve an application for research on children if it can be demonstrated that it is impossible to carry out this research on adults and translate the findings to children. We definitely need to be convinced that the outcome and the hypothesis will generate knowledge that is going to improve the health of this community. And we have to be obviously convinced that the children involved will be exposed to the minimum of risks. The burden on them is going to be very, very small. That we're cognizant that when we're dealing with children, their capacity to withstand pain may be different from an adult. They may feel discomfort. They will feel fear much more so than our adult community. And so research has been designed for kids and for children. It has to remain cognizant of that community and may sometimes need those additional supports in place to prove to the Research Ethics Committee that everything has been put in place to ensure that the participants, unfortunately, have to be children only, but that they will be absolutely safeguarded. Under 12, parents will be the ones who will do the consenting. In some countries, they will also ask the children, they will give them an assent form, which is like, it's a watered down version of an informed consent process where the child is sat down and the research team, in the presence of parents or legal representatives, will talk through what's going to happen in a trial. And the child still may say no, and we have to respect that. If it does say no, we usually will have parents try and find out what is the reason for it, and is there some sort of misunderstanding? Is there something that we can do to help the child understand better? If a child says no, no is no, absolutely at the very end of the conversation. And we do often get kids to sign assent forms. So you will generally see a trial who was doing a trial maybe at 0 to 2, 2 to 8, 8 to 12, 12 to 16. There will be individual consent forms for each of those age groups. The wording used will have to reflect the age group it's aimed at. A lot of the younger age groups will be done in the form of infographics. And as I said, I just mentioned assent earlier on. So assent is where we ask the child, even though it's not informed consent, we're still respecting the child's dignity and their autonomy, and we're explaining everything to that child. Everything about the trial has to be explained to them. And they can sign a form, or they can say, no, I don't want to participate in this. And we are obliged to respect that wish. Again, we can reconsent because consent is a rolling process. And we spoke earlier about incapacitated adults who gain capacity. What are the other reasons that would cause us to go back and get consent again? So if the research protocol has changed in any way, if something has come up during the study that has resulted in us changing the format of the study, and it has to go back to a research ethics committee, we then have to reconsent every single one of our participants, because what they originally consented to has now changed. If during a study, new safety information about the drug or the intervention comes to light from additional studies elsewhere, we now have to go back to every single applicant and go, we've got new information about this drug. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Here it is. Do you still want to participate in this study? If alternative treatments become available. So when somebody enters the studies, as I've mentioned earlier, sometimes people don't have access to therapeutics at all, and that's part of their motivating factor to participate. Sometimes something else might happen in the area and they will have access. That might change their outlook on the study. So we do need to go back and say, something else has come up which would be suitable for your condition. Do you want to opt out of the study? Do you want to continue in the study? And do you want to go and try something else? If a child is under 18 or under 16 for clinical trials, when they start a study, once they reach 18, we have to reconsent them, because now they're deemed an adult. Again, an incapacitated adult who regains capacity. So if emergency consent was taken on behalf of an adult who was incapacitated at the time the study started, if they regain capacity, I mentioned earlier, we need to sit them down and go through the entire consent process with them and obtain their written or oral or e-consent, whichever is more appropriate. Or if we're doing a longitudinal study, which we do a lot of in the area that I work with. So like we have a lot of preterm babies who are in their 30s now. Who I think 36 is probably the longest study we've done. If a study is ongoing that long, we will often go back to the participants over time because the study has gone on 36 years, just to sort of make sure, check in with them and make sure they still know they're in the study, that they understand the detail of it, and do they simply want to continue in it. Incidental findings would be like unanticipated things that we find in the course of research, which are outside the scope of the research. So we're looking for one thing and a whole bunch of other stuff comes up. They're called incidental findings. So for example, if we take a blood sample from a participant and we're looking for a specific component of that blood sample, but we spot other stuff that might be problematic, what are we going to do with those? What is our obligation? Do we just ignore them? Do we just pretend we didn't see them because they're not part of the study? What is our responsibility? And incidental findings have to be covered in the informed consent process so that participants know that if something does come up, there is a pathway, a defined pathway for them, that if this thing is problematic, their GP is informed and then they can pursue whatever treatment they need. But it definitely needs to be highlighted. And I think it's a problematic area because sometimes things do come up that are unexpected. But research ethics committees are the ones who will have a look at every application and make sure that there is a plan in place that if such findings do appear, what is the responsibility around disclosure, who manages it, who arranges the referral back to the GP or onto another medical professional, who gives the medical advice. So all of those things have to be considered, but the mention of incidental findings needs to be highlighted in the informed consent form so that participants understand what they are. And we need to, as a research ethics committee, we need to make sure that the laboratories that studies are using are accredited so that any findings that they do come up are reliable. There is a duty of care that exists always in a research study to your participants. It is very important that we continue to maintain confidentiality. But again, if we, at the start of a study, explain to our participants that we will tell their GP if they're participating in a study, that opens the door then for us to speak to their GP if an incidental finding comes up. So what about withdrawing consent? Well, it has to happen at the very first conversation. All applicants must be told that their participation is voluntary, but they can withdraw at any time during the study, absolutely any time. And they don't have to give an explanation. It won't affect their access to services. There is always that fear and that vulnerability that if I say no, I won't get the care I want. And again, it's that sort of paternalistic sort of doctor-patient scenario. And I think we're getting better at it. I think patients are a little more informed these days. Sometimes patients will withdraw from a study, but they may have already provided biological data and they may decide you can keep that or you can keep it for future use. So those conversations have to be very explicitly had, and it needs to be very clear when the patient is withdrawing what they're withdrawing from, that everyone is clear. So is it just the study? Is it everything? Is it all the optional studies that they also are attached onto the original study? It's just about being very transparent. We do have one exception. So once the results of a research study have been published or they've been sort of disseminated in the research community, we cannot withdraw that information. And the information is anonymized. And I think therein lies a bit of the explanation that tends to not happen often enough with patients. So patients don't often realize what anonymization is. It's where we take their data, we strip every aspect of their name, their date of birth, anything that identified that piece of data as being from them, that now is anonymized. Once that goes into a data set, it is impossible to physically remove it. So I think we need to have those conversations early on with patients so they realize that at some point in a study, it will be impossible to withdraw certain data that has already been assimilated into data sets. So,
Mandy, we just have a hand up from Christina. Are you okay to take a question now, maybe?
of course, yes. Hi, Christina.
Christina, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Okay, maybe it's a mistake. Yeah, let's move on.
Back to her later. Don't worry, I won't forget. I won't forget. So there's some areas where we don't actually need consent, and we're all familiar with COVID-19 at this point. So I won't labor the point. But we have what's called a Health Research Consent Declaration Committee. It is appointed by our Minister of Health. It's whereby health research can take place in this country, and we don't have to ask participants for their consent. What it tends to focus on is where we use personal data as opposed to getting participants into a hospital room to give blood or a skin graft or a biopsy. So it's data sets that already exist, but for the greater good of society, and where it would be absolutely impossible to go out to the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who gave that data, which will be anonymized anyway. We have a committee, as I said, government appointed, that makes a decision that says, yes, this research is for the good of society. We have to do it. We don't have therapeutics in a particular area. We have a data set that will help us make a decision and will help us access a therapeutic faster. And they allow that research to happen. It also has to be approved by a research ethics committee. But once the Health Research Consent Declaration Committee have seen it, you can be rest assured that obviously we're not going to withdraw that. Enough investigation is done. The legal framework around data protection still applies. So there is absolutely no way that personal data will be disclosed, but it's research that can only happen on huge data sets where we just simply can't go and get a permission from everybody else. So as I said, before this wave of consent happens, a research ethics committee has to be convinced that it has to happen, the reasons why it's going to happen, why consent can't be obtained. So if you've got a data set with like 1 million pieces of data from 1 million different people, it's not reasonable to think you can go and get that go out to each individual and obtain their consent. And as it is, that data is already anonymized, so it would be very, very difficult. And I think it's like a double layer of protection that society needs this research to happen. And how do we ensure that everybody's privacy is still respected? When we approach participants to participate in studies, we don't often see the real picture. And what I've done here is I've shown you the iceberg where we see the tip, but there's a lot more underneath. And what I mean about that is taking the area that I work in, when we approach families to participate in clinical trials, we may see a family with a new baby, but we don't necessarily know where they're at. And we need, as researchers, to be very cognizant of their situation. So a family who appears in a neonatal unit with a new baby who's very sick, who's very small, who may be on life support. We have a mom who's probably beating herself up because she delivered early and she's blaming herself. You've got fear the baby isn't going to live. Mom and dad are probably really, really scared to bond with their baby. They may not have touched their child. I didn't touch my child. I wasn't allowed to hold my child for 4 weeks, the first 4 weeks of her life. They're full of worry. They're just full of despair. They're angry at the world. Their dreams are gone. And then somebody's approaching them to participate in a clinical trial. And as I referenced my own experience, I have very little memory of it because I know I was in emotional turmoil at the time. So when we do approach patients in a clinical setting, it is absolutely necessary to remind ourselves of where they're at. Like, what is their life like at the moment? Are they in a position to make a decision? Maybe today isn't a good day. Maybe I should go and find out from the staff on the ward how their day has been. So there were days when I would come to the ward and my daughter would have, for want of a better word, died on a couple of occasions. I needed CPR. Probably wasn't the best day to talk to me about participating in the clinical trial. So there's a lot going on in a clinical setting that we don't necessarily see. And I think as researchers, we need to be very cognizant of that. What we do say, well, I've done some work for TrioPacker, which is another clinical study. We've done some videos for researchers explaining to them what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. So if you're a researcher and you're approaching a family or an individual, it is so important that you know their backstory, you know your audience, you know who you're going to be dealing with. The people that we recruit as recruiters in our research studies How do we upskill them so that they are observers, that they know what's going on the ward, they know they can read the scene when they arrive. Is today a good day to approach that family? Is not? There's a certain amount of training needs to be done to ensure that we recruit the right type of patient and that we don't actually inflict additional trauma on patients who are already in a very high risk area. How do we do this? We've been doing it now for the last 10 years here, and it's PPI-led recruitment. So PPI is public and patient involvement, which I'm sure is a term that's used throughout the EU. But if we involve patients early in our study designs, not only is the study designed better, it's more transparent. The outcomes and the endpoints are going to be more meaningful for the patient community, but it also allows the patient community to upskill researchers how best to approach patients in high dependency areas and ICUs. How do I recruit in an area that is already very traumatic? And a lot of researchers shy away from it. They find it very difficult. And they do appreciate patients going, you know, this is how you could have done it better in my situation. You know, you could have waited a day or two. We could have maybe done it not in an open room. So we go through some scenarios with research students, and we act them out, and we teach them that, okay, you may be very reticent about approaching a family to participate in a trial with their child, but you know, coming in head on, talking about the trial is not the way to do it. That there is a way of approaching, introducing who you are. The family have no idea who you are. They're in a setting that they're not familiar with. It is very important that you introduce yourself, explain that you're not part of the medical team, because there's an awful lot of confusion amongst patients who are in trials. They call the trial study team their medical team. They think they're getting treatment, but they're not. They're just getting a medical intervention that's on being tested. So we know that patients don't often fully understand the concept. It's very important when we're talking to families initially, when we're introducing the concept of informed consent, that we talk about them, how they're doing, how's their life, how's the baby doing, how's the child doing, how are you doing, what's happening, as opposed to launching into all the detail about the trial. It's important that you listen attentively, because a lot of families, as I said, might feel vulnerable. They may not feel in a position to participate, or in patients exactly the same. So watching body language, listening to what they're saying, maybe listening to what they're not saying about their ideas of clinical trials, watching them at all times. So it is important, I think, to train our recruiters about reading body language. I do it with babies. I read infant cues constantly in my job, and adults are equally as, they're open books. And I think we need to be upskilling so that we can approach the right families at the right time. I mentioned earlier, it's so important that potential trial participants are given sufficient time to digest what's happening in a trial. A lot of information on trials to take on board. Again, maybe the place to explain the study is not in the ICU. Maybe you can arrange a time in an office with a potential participant, allow them that privacy, that space where they can think through what's going to happen. Maybe some questions might come to mind in a different space. So how do we get a participant to give us informed consent? We give them as much information as we can. And what does that look like? It can be information leaflets, it can be in the form of posters, videos, advertisements, interview questions, whatever. What is most important is, once you've given your participant all this material, is to revisit what their understanding of it is. Sometimes we need to rephrase what we've just said. Some people do better with infographics or drawings. It's always good to repeat the salient parts of the trial detail. Obviously, being flexible is one of the important things, because when a participant, especially in a hospital setting, has been invited to participate in a trial, they're in a very vulnerable situation, and you insisting that they make a decision by 3 o'clock may not suit what's happening in their treatment. So it's very important that you remember, as a researcher, that this is not about you, this is about the patient, and whatever their situation is, you have to respect it. And likewise, if you find yourself in that position as a patient, it's okay to say, now's not a good time. Can you come back again later on or tomorrow? So you have that equity between both of you. Some people get triggered by the whole clinical trial thing. So there are things that come up in clinical trials that might be upsetting. It's funny, on a research ethics committee, we have a lot of lay people, as I mentioned, and we have a support structure in place for some of our lay people, so that if they have a clinical trial coming across their desk that maybe is in their disease specific area, we have a support mechanism for them in case there are any triggers. It's always good to be aware that a trial might be a trial in your eyes, but from a participant's perspective, it may trigger other things for them that they may need additional supports for. And every trial should be designed with those additional supports. And how do we do that? We ensure that patients design the trials and those supports are built in. So the ideal participant information leaflet, which is what informs the consent process, it should have short sentences, no more than 20 words, plain language, words we're all familiar with, one idea per sentence. Lay terminology first. You can put the technical equivalent in brackets, but the lay is the one that comes first. We have to make sure that there's no use of abbreviations. Words like EOR, A&E, they mean the same thing, but different. They look different to different people in different countries. We have to be cognizant of who our audience is. If our audience is elderly, maybe has sight problems, the font has to be adapted, and the mode of transmitting the information has to be adapted to the audience. Again, I mentioned a lot of use of flow diagrams and infographics. Patient information leaflets are hugely text dense. They are incredibly boring to read. They are even worse to write. And anything to make them easier for both sides is very much appreciated. And in recent years, we're seeing a lot of use of infographics, and they are, as a research ethics committee, we encourage it because they speak more than words. They are very, very clear. And some studies are hugely beneficial when they come across our desk, and the vast majority of the information for the patient community is a mixture of text and infographics. It's important that we obviously tailor our information for the community that we're addressing, whether it's visually impaired, neurologically impaired, cognitively impaired. Again, using patients to design your patient information leaflet is the best approach you can take. There's no better approach. And we should always, when we're reading a patient information leaflet, and if you're the potential participant, it should be written from your perspective. So you should be able to read it as an everyday lay person. All the language should be easy to understand. But the onus for researchers is to justify why they don't put stuff in. And we as a research ethics committee will often question that. So we will see information that's in a protocol that doesn't feed through a patient information leaflet. And that is part of the job of a research ethics committee. It's to pick out those things that we think might be important in the protocol and then question the research group and say, why did you not put this in the patient information leaflet? We had an example actually only this week of where a study prohibited women expressing colostrum, which is the initial breast milk, before they gave birth if they were part of the study. And it was very explicit in the protocol that they were not to express colostrum and use it. And this was not in the patient information leaflet. Now, colostrum is liquid gold in terms of it's the first breast milk you give to babies. It's very calorie dense, it's very nutrient dense, and mums are encouraged to give it. So that's a very important thing not to include in the patient information leaflet. And that is the role of research ethics committees. It's to delve down into every aspect of what the researcher is saying the research is about and what the actual participant is being told. And we have to make sure that they all align. And this is just one example this week that it's been a while since we come across one as obvious as that. But, you know, we obviously would go back now to the researchers and go, we don't even care why you didn't put it in the patient information leaflet. It has to be in it. Maybe it was an omission. Okay, so the obvious things we're going to look for in patient information leaflets is the name of the study, what the research question is, where it's taking place, what's going to happen, what investigations are going to happen to me as an individual, how much blood is going to be taken, how many biopsies, how many MRIs, how do I participate, what makes me eligible to participate, who designed the study, were patients involved? And I think we're seeing more and more patients design studies. And these are the ones that are getting ethics approval much faster because they are designed through the lens of patients who need the treatments. And we also need to know standard of care for patients who will be affected by them participating in the study. That's a very important aspect for somebody who's considering giving their consent. It is really important that we tell patients what we're going to do with their data, where it's going to go. We describe what anonymization is, randomization, blinding. Again, this week we saw a trial come across our desk where these terms were used and not explained. And, you know, in this day and age, it's a little bit annoying because you feel we've asked this question on several occasions. You know, it should be normal. Don't use terminology that is not used by a 12-year-old. And that is the rule of thumb. If a 12-year-old can read your patient information leaflet, you've done a good job. All the risks have to be outlined. If the patient is going to feel any discomfort from any of the interventions, that has to be clearly outlined. Any potential side effects. If there are alternative procedures, and maybe this trial isn't for you, and there's something else that you might be advantageous, we have to outline those to patients because we have to be transparent. It's really important, I suppose, in studies to be very clear about if a patient intends getting pregnant while participating in the study, or fathering a child, or breastfeeding. All of our studies need to be explicit about any life changes that may happen during the course of that study, so the participant is aware that they're prohibited from getting pregnant. How do they do that? Will their general practitioner be told that they're involved in the study? Will they be exposed to ionizing radiation? How many X-rays are they going to have? How many MRIs are they going to have? How many ultrasounds? All of these are additional risks, but they have to be outlined so that the participant has a overall view of what's happening, and then they can balance up everything and think, well, okay, is it still worth my while participating? Are there still benefits for me? Could I still participate in this and not affect my treatment? Is there a chance that this will actually make it better for people in the future? We talked about incidental findings earlier. This is a bit of the genetic test one is becoming much more problematic because we are entering an era where we're gathering everything. The genome analysis is becoming the buzzword. I still don't know if we as a society have quite regulated what we're going to do with all these genetic tests results that we have. And it's an area where we're treading very carefully as research ethics committees, because we don't know yet the potential for all these genetic test results that are going to be sitting in biobanks, and who's going to own them, what's going to be done with them, how long are we going to keep them, what on earth could we do later on? You know, we can't even imagine. So I think it's very important that when there are genetic tests been done as part of a study, that our participants have a clear framework as to what's happening, what's being gathered, why it's being gathered, and where it's going to be stored and for how long.
Mandy, sorry, just to interrupt, we're at 5:03, so can wrap up in 5-10 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you, because we have lots of questions in the chat from people, lots of comments, so.
Okay, so our participants also need to be told if something happens during the trial, if they get injured, what happens to them? Who's going to make sure they get better? Who do they claim from? We need to know that if there are going to be any papers, any outcomes in the research, it is absolutely important that the participants in the trial are part of that loop closing exercise where they are told what happens in the research, that they know what they did. They know that either it was a positive or a negative outcome, and if it's published in journals, that they are sent links that they can read the paper, that they can actually inform themselves what actually happened. It's important also that if they have a complaint to make during the study, that they know who they can contact. Again, I mentioned earlier payment. It's burdensome for patients to actually participate in trials, so we do need to reimburse any of their expenses. As long as it's reasonable expenses, as a research ethics committee, it's absolutely fine. Data is governed by the General Data Protection Act, and I think it's something we shy away from. Every study will have a data controller who manages what happens to the data, what's collected, where it's stored, and this person's information must be made available to people in their consent form, so that they know if they have a query, a complaint, they want to withdraw, they want to take back their data, they need that point of contact, and that needs to be very explicitly clear in the informed consent. Every study, obviously, their data protection has a law governing that study, and that needs to be highlighted in the patient information leaflets. Any data that's stored, it needs to be explained to the patients why it's being stored, what data is being stored, where it's being stored, and what it's going to be used for in the future. It's really important, obviously, in terms of genomics, what we store and what we're going to use for in the future, and where it goes. Does it stay in your country? Does it go to another country where they have their laws are a little bit more lax than ours? So if we don't tell patients this, or they're not getting a full picture. And we need to be really clear as patients, if we're going to participate in the study, that we maintain some control over our data. So we need to know who's gathering it, where it's been gathered. Will it be for commercial use? Will it be used for research in the future? Will it be research in only one particular area or general research? Will I be asked about it, or will it just be used without me being asked at all? The research ethics committees who approve all these studies will also be mentioned in the patient information leaflet. So if there are any queries, the patient information leaflet should be sufficiently full of the information that patients need, that they don't have to go ask a question. Now, sometimes it's buried, and that's where the questioning, obviously, before they sign the informed consent form happens. But there are certain things that we like to see. We like to see any conditions that we as a committee have outlined published in a patient information leaflet. And if a trial participant wants any contact, if they need a point of contact, and usually there is that one person, but it needs to be very explicit in the patient information leaflet. It needs to be highlighted. What we're encouraging more these days is a plain English summary, which is like an executive summary of your 40-page patient information leaflet. And it can be 2 pages. It's literally an overview of the trial. It helps reduce the burden on participants. Now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't read the patient information leaflet. But what it does is it highlights the important parts of the research that will inform whether they want to participate or not. And it's a complement, it's not replacing the patient information leaflet. The very end of all studies I've mentioned before, it is important that once you've signed a consent form, you get a copy back. Your GP should be informed that you are participating in a trial. Throughout the study, we should be informing patients how things are going. There are usually interim reports produced. Our participants should be getting that. They should feel part of that. They're not just subjects. They're part of a process. They should be given access to all the journal publications arising out of the study. Any of the study results and lay summaries which are written by patients should also be given to them. And most importantly, I think we need to acknowledge the time and the effort that patients put into clinical research. We don't do enough thanking. It's always the case that we got your data now, that's it, we're delighted. We need to close off that loop if we are to do better research and continue to encourage patients to participate in this. So that is that in a bit of a nutshell. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll see how many questions we have.
Mandy, thanks so much for that. That's perfect. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. Veronica had 3 questions. One is on oral consent. Is oral consent ethical consent, or does it have legal power as well?
It certainly has, it has both. It has both, as long as there's a record kept. So even though there's no signature and there's a record kept of the conversation, because it isn't always possible to get people to sign their name for maybe conflict that's happening, or there's a risk about the researcher or the participant, but as long as there's a record kept somewhere that the conversation has happened.
Great. And regarding tiered consent, as you mentioned, the moment of start of a clinical trial can be stressful. Do you think it would be ethical to ask participants to consent to secondary use of their data at a moment when they might not have the capacity to deal with the information at that time?
No, absolutely not. Tiered consent can be very complex. And as a research ethics committee, we will generally not approve a tiered consent if we feel that, as it is, the patient community are already overburdened by their illness. So we take everything into account before approving any tiered consent. It's not just because you tier it doesn't necessarily mean that the ethics committee will approve it. They will take the entire picture into account.
Great. And the last question from Veronica was, you mentioned the responsibility of returning incidental findings to clinical trial participants. What are your thoughts on the return of individual results to clinical trial participants?
We don't do that. I suppose it needs to be very clear that participants are participating in a trial with a view to answering a particular research question. It is made explicitly clear, it should be made explicitly clear to patients that they will not be getting that information back. I suppose we don't have the capacity within trials to manage all of that information going back. And I think at this point, we just simply can't do it. We're never ever asked for that because we know the capacity isn't there to do it, and it's not the purpose of the trial. It's to answer a particular scientific question, as opposed to we're taking 4 liters of the blood over the next 4 years. We're going to tell you everything we find. We're not going to do that. We will only tell you the incidental findings. The other stuff is just being specifically for the purposes of the trial.
Great, thank you for that. Does anybody else have any questions? If you want to raise your hand.
I have a question. Has anybody here sat on a research ethics committee? Or do you have research ethics committees in your country that have patients sitting on them? Is probably a more appropriate question. And if not, no. Because as I said, in our country, we have a research ethics committee and they meet with research ethics. Oh, hello, Stacey. Stacey's from Ireland. So I've just seen her hand up. So like our research ethics committees are also part of a European group who represent research ethics committees from different countries. And I'm amazed to see that there's nobody representing the patient community. And maybe that's a conversation that needs to be had, back in your own communities, because I think the added value of having that patient lens at research ethics stage is that trials only get approved that have been seen by patients who understand what it's like to be a patient. That's a lens that researchers, educators, industry partners can never have. And it adds it's added value to that whole area of approving trials. Tamara, you have your hand up.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I'm in the car. So to answer your question, we have patients sitting on ethical boards in research institutions in Portugal. Okay, I think that's very important, and it's mandatory, basically, no doubt about that. And I have a question for you, which is related to the informed consent of a capable adult that decreases mental or physical health, which would need a new informed consent, right? Whose responsibility is it to report this alteration of the state of the participant?
So
if not himself is able to report, what do we do in that case?
What we do is it's the responsibility of the research team to recognize that capacity is no longer present. And then you've got that conversation around legal representation, or in this country, implementing the Assisted Decision-Making Act, so that we are certain that that person wishes to continue, but we can only do that by involving their legal representative. So the responsibility is always on the research team at all times to be aware that that person has capacity at all times.
Okay, I imagine that may be difficult in some situations to make that assessment. So that can be a problem for the responsible.
Yeah, and there again, I think lies the sort of question about what training do our researchers get in that area? I can't answer that question. I mean, what I might deem somebody's is incapacitated, somebody else might have a completely different viewpoint. So there are lots of things like that still are uncertainties in the area, but I think it would be, if you want, the clear question is whose responsibility is it? It's the research team, absolutely. But I can't guarantee that actually happens in practice.
Thank you. I imagine that. Thank you.
Veronica, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mandy. Great presentation. Thank you. It's more of comment than a question. It's relating to the previous question. Basically, what I was trying to say is that, of course, the trial aims to prove something, but that the two aims are not separate. So the patients who take a risk are in a way entitled to some kind of return of value. And this is the way that the research, the society can actually return this value to them, because that information, that health data is very, very important to them, to their healthcare, to every aspect of their lives. So this is why I asked, because there are a lot of discussions in this area, and I really wanted to see where Ireland stands on this, and if this is something that is being considered. I know the systems at this point do not allow for this to happen. But if there is a will, it will eventually move forward and be implemented, because we do have the technical capacity. The technical capacity does exist. It just needs to be properly implemented.
And I think that's where the patient community needs to work collaboratively to highlight that point and bring it to the table, because if we do it individually, it's not going to be heard. But I think there are platforms for us as a community to highlight to our research community the value, as you say, of taking that data for other purposes. It is of absolute value. I would love to know the stuff that was done on my daughter, and I don't have the results of it. And yeah, I think it just needs to be a conversation that needs to be done, needs to be had.
Yeah.
Collaboratively.
For some patients, it could actually, I mean, there are patients who need to redo some tests because they have done them during the trial, but they do not have the results. They've done biopsies, a lot of invasive tests that they never received the results from. And those are very relevant for their day-to-day care.
Absolutely, I hear you, and I agree. And it's probably a conversation maybe we should all be starting individually. It's something it's never come up in our research ethics committee, but now you've given me some food for thought for next month's meeting.
I'm glad I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I like to learn new things.
Yeah, actually on that, we had a question in the registration form around hospitals and ethics committees, maybe have different knowledge or an understanding of what is ethical. So the question in the registration form was, how can patients solve this? Do you have any ideas in addition?
Would you believe it's a conversation I literally had this week, because I teach in Poland and in a hospital who are doing a study, and the study is going to be approved by the hospital ethics committee, which doesn't have patients on it. And it's around the area of gathering breast milk from mums of preterm babies. Now, preterm babies cannot be given formula, and they must be given breast milk, otherwise they will die. That's it in a very simplified form. And I was horrified that the study was taking life-saving breast milk to analyze in the lab and not give it to babies. And I was like, that would never, ever be approved by the national office in Ireland. But at the hospital ethics committee, their attitude is, we've done this before, it's fine. And it's the first time I've been in conflict with another ethics committee where the lens through which they were looking did not reflect the patient community. And I wholly agree with you that we need to standardize. And it's a conversation that is actually, it is occurring at present. It's every ethics committee has a slightly different viewpoint. And even in Ireland, we have 2 clinical trial committees, and even they have 2 different viewpoints, and the national office. And we've discussed this about how do we standardize that lens. It's a huge issue. It is a problem. And the hospital ethics committees are very different from the national office, because they are much more, the community that work on that ethics committee are much more concentrated. They don't necessarily have that broader lens that we do at the national office. So we have statisticians, we have all sorts of experts, we have lots of lay people. So we are bringing all that different expertise to the table. I don't have an answer. It is a problem, absolutely. And as I said, I've encountered it personally. I think the conversation, because national ethics offices are now gaining in momentum internationally, and they themselves are forming a network under the EU Commission, I think it is going to get better, but we're still only in that infancy of this discussion, and it's going to continue for the next, I'd say for 5 years. We're not going to actually see much in terms of standardization, because the 2 systems are still going to happen in tandem with each other. And until everything is under the one umbrella, and we have some control over education, learning, which is one thing we do in the national office, is if we have an application that comes in and we learn something from it, or something new has happened in the study, or someone has adopted a new way of presenting a study to us, we keep that in a repository so that all of our ethics committee members can learn from it. And I think we need to be doing that internationally, so we have a standardized lens through which we view things. As I said, it's not happening at present. But I think then it's up to patients. If there are anomalies like that don't sit well with you, somebody needs to raise these in order for the conversation to happen, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. We have quite a few comments from some people in the chats. Brian Denga Denise Dunn and Elizabeth Broom. So I don't know if anybody wants to share those comments with us and maybe discuss, or if we have any other questions. Maybe people are a bit shy.
That's okay. It's okay. We don't need to, we don't need to push people into it.
No, exactly. In that case, thank you so much, Mandy. That was great, super interesting. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your knowledge. I will put the link to a survey in the chat, or maybe Sharon can help me do that. And also we'll put the link to the next meetup. So we really hope to see you there. If you have any questions in the meantime, let us know. And we'll also share the recording and the presentation slides in the alumni space on the Open Academy website after. So thank you very much, everybody. And again, thank you, Mandy, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you.